As you may know, we had boots on the ground in downtown Ottawa for nearly a month. We, in fact, embedded our reporter with the trucker convoy a week before it even got to Ottawa, and covering the trucker convoy, I think, was the highlight of the last year for us. It was such a condensed and concentrated political moment that has yielded so many results. I put it to you that the truckers did more to change the debate in Canada and to get more freedom-oriented results than any other actor in the past 2 years. And you always hear me say it, more than the courts, more than the opposition, more than the media, more than academia. The truckers did an organic, authentic grassroots movement. It was amazing. And it was really our time to shine as Rebel News. We, at one time, had people in 9 different cities covering different emanations of the truckers. In fact, as far away as Canberra, Australia. Our chief Australian correspondent was there. And I felt that there were a clash of narratives. Rebel News was on one side with a handful of other independents against the media party. As you know, that's a phrase I use loosely for the political media industrial complex quite often, journalists with legacy media. But I have to say, other than my dear friends at Rebel News, the most effective journalist in Ottawa covering the convoy was not a Rebel. I mean, I think Rebel did wonderfully, and I would say we did a great job. But there was an outstanding journalist who I think really made her mark. And she reported, she's a freelance columnist. She writes for the National Post. She writes for an impressive list, a roster of other media, including the Wall Street Journal, where she was in just today. Her name is Rupa Subramanya, and I am delighted to talk to her today via Skype from Ottawa. Rupa, what a pleasure to meet you. I've become a super fan, even though we've never had a chance to talk before. I follow you so closely on Twitter. I want to congratulate you for your journalism. I love what our Rebels are doing, and I think they're first rate. But to have you writing in the National Post and in the Wall Street Journal, you were bringing a different point of view to people who otherwise might not have heard it.
Thanks, Ezra. It's great to be here, and it's great to finally meet you. And I also want to give a shout out to your team for covering the protests. I know they were there to the very end and right on the front lines. And you know, there was a lot of live streaming from there, so I really appreciate that coverage as well. So Ezra, I'm an outsider in journalism. Really, I'm a trained economist. My specialties are economics, and my expertise is economics and IR, and not necessarily the kind of stuff that I worked on recently. Maybe that's what gave me this perspective, the outsider's perspective on what was happening here. And what happened here is, before the convoy even showed up in Ottawa, there was already a received narrative in place. And that that narrative was pushed forward by a handful of journalists and amplified by their echo chamber, that the protesters, the truckers, were a bunch of white supremacists, anti-vaxxers, racists, bigots, here to overthrow the government, and just pretty much anything bad you could say about them was said at that time. Now, to be fair, there were elements attached to the convoy, and they didn't do any favors. They didn't do themselves any favors by that they were part of the convoy. I feel like the convoy should have been very aggressive right from the get-go in just saying that these guys have nothing to do with that. I know that they did that several times during the course of the protests, but I do feel that that should have been dealt with right from the get-go. But having said that, I went as a resident of the city where I live, not as a journalist, not as a writer, but just as someone who wanted to see what was happening. I live right in the market, so I have a bird's eye view of what is happening. So I went there keeping an open mind. I was aware of this received narrative. I'd read all of that stuff, and I wanted to just check it out for myself and see what was happening. And I discovered that my first impressions were, well, I mean, this feels a lot like Canada Day. It felt like a winter carnival. There was so much, just so much joy and happiness. And, you saw the maple leaf everywhere. You saw people laughing. There were kids. There was lots of music. And you were there. So you experienced some of this as well. That was striking. And, as I made my way through the crowds, and I spent pretty much all day there, I was struck by, it wasn't just a whole bunch of white people. I saw Black Canadians, I saw Sikh Canadians, I saw Asians, I saw pretty much everyone, and everything was peaceful. There was nothing, as a person of color, and as a woman, I walked through this protest, and felt completely safe. Felt really, I didn't feel anything bad at all during the protests. And when I came home, and I told my partner, the political class in this country has completely underestimated what's going on here. They're completely out of touch. They're detached. And I even tweeted this, and I got a lot of pushback, especially from some very well-known journalists, and they mocked me, and they said, "This is just a fringe group of people. It won't last for a couple of days. It's like the annual get-together of the PPP, the People's Party of Canada, the PPC." And nothing, and there's going to be no political repercussions, no political consequences at all coming out of this. And then what happened was, a few days later, the leader of the Conservative Party was fired by his own caucus. The protests continued on for 3 weeks. Trudeau had to declare an emergency. There was even dissent within his own party. So that's what ended up happening.
Well, it was incredible, and you really walked around. Like I was there for a few days. It was so very cold. I have to say, it was actually physically a challenge to cover this story. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, I saw you out there every day, all day. I saw you on your Twitter feed, and the stories you wrote. And so that's the kind of shoe leather journalism that I think really works for events like this. I think a lot of the critics in what I call the media party never even went down there. Like my old friend Andrew Coyne, I'm certain he didn't physically go there. He was writing from his apartment somewhere and in Toronto. So I think that you saw things with your own eyes. You saw people of every background. You mentioned race, but there's also a class element too. Working class people, and they look different. They're not as fancy. They don't have the exact perfect words that the silver-tongued devils who work in Parliament Hill do. And so there were some people a little rough around the edges, and I think that brought out a kind of snobbery and condescension. There's a great lawyer in Toronto named Ryan O'Connor who he calls it the Peloton class. People who they loved the lockdowns because they got themselves that expensive Peloton workout machine, and maybe they had a country cottage. So the fancy people sort of said, yuck. I don't like truckers. I only like it when they drop off an Amazon package and I don't even have to see them. They leave it at the door. I don't actually want to meet a trucker. And I felt there was a classism, and I'm not a Marxist, but it's hard not to notice some of the sneering. That same Andrew Coyne was calling them yobs. That's a British term for sort of lower class football hooligans. I don't know. Yeah. I think you really nailed it because you were doing that shoe leather journalism. You were there looking people in the eye, seeing what it was really like instead of just reading some pre-approved talking points.
So you have the digital economy, and and that's all of us who are part of the digital economy. We've managed to get through the last 2 years, navigating the pandemic through Zoom and Peloton and whatnot, right? But then you have the working class, they lay the brick and mortar of the economy. They're part of the brick and mortar of the economy, and they've been completely, speaking to them, you get the sense that they've been completely left out. They've been affected by the lockdowns, they've been affected by the restrictions, and then you had the mandates that kicked in, and then I think that was the final straw for many of these folks. And what was unfortunate about all of this is that that there was no real attempt to really even try to understand where they were coming from. It was easier to denigrate and mock them and call them names, and then when you were tired of that, you went back to calling them racists and white supremacists. There was no real attempt to actually find out, why are they upset? Why are they angry? What's the source of their frustration? And that is what I tried to do. I mean, all I did was talk to people. I just got out of my apartment. It was cold, I'm not, I was dressed warmly, but, if you're there for 10, 12 hours every day, that's pretty, that's quite that's not good for you. But I went there and I spoke to people, and there were these people with some real some heartbreaking stories. These are real people who've suffered during the pandemic, and nobody really wants to even engage with them. They're not all anti-vaxxers. Sure, there are some who are anti-vaxxers. They will not take a vaccine, any vaccine of any kind. But there was also a lot of, there are people who had recovered from COVID. Now, we know the research on people who've recovered from COVID. They actually have very high antibodies. So why are we forcing them to take the vaccine? And so there were a lot of people like that. There were people who have a history of heart condition in their families and are not able to get a medical exemption from the vaccine. Now, this is something I didn't know about. So there was a lot of stuff that I learned for the first time, Ezra, and this was an eye-opening experience for me. I thought getting a medical exemption wouldn't be a big deal, or even a religious exemption. In fact, when those things were announced, I thought, these are potential loopholes. If you want, in the vaccine with vaccination, that people who don't want to get vaccinated will cite, medical reasons and religious reasons. But these are actually very hard to get. So these two siblings I met, they were not diagnosed with myocarditis, but they have a history of heart disease. They themselves have some kind of a heart condition, which is not myocarditis. You can only get this exemption for myocarditis. But think about the fact that you're really worried about this. It's not myocarditis that you have, but you're worried about it. You don't want to take the vaccine. Mm-hmm. We need to understand that fear instead of mocking them, right? What we've done is we've mocked and denigrated these individuals. Young people's lives have changed considerably. So people who used to love to travel, can no longer do that because they're prisoners in their own country. They can't get on a plane. And backpack across the world if they wanted to. They can't go for a hockey game, so they can't go on a date, and it's been quite for me it was an eye-opening experience, because I'll be very honest with you, I'm triple vaccinated, and I kind of initially I thought the mandates would be a way of getting more people vaccinated, but I hadn't quite realized how deeply unjust and discriminatory this whole thing has been. And so it really did open my eyes, and that only happened because I spoke to people and I tried to understand where they were coming from.
Well, that's real journalism, isn't it? I got one last question for you. You mentioned a few moments ago that Erin O'Toole was perhaps the first political casualty of the truckers, because his Conservative MPs didn't feel like he was being open-minded enough. He was being really shy. It was like he was afraid of the CBC being mean to him if he talked to a trucker. There's been a lot of other things that these truckers, I think, a lot of other dominoes that have fallen. I said it before, I think they made a big difference. But one institution that I think is in absolute denial, and they have had no reckoning for their role, not just in the last month, but the last 2 years, I think it's the media. And I think that in politics, there are consequences for getting it wrong. You can be thrown out, like Erin O'Toole was. Or you can admit you're wrong and make changes like, frankly, most provincial governments are doing very quickly. But I don't think there's been a reckoning in most of the media. In fact, I see that the new narrative from the media class is we were victimized, we were threatened. Some of the journalists who went down there said, I was heckled. Now, I grant you some people had some swears sworn at them. And I think in one case there was someone who spat, and I don't like that. That's actually assault. And someone said someone threw something, and I don't agree with that. But the whole media class is saying we're the true victims here. We need armed guards on Parliament Hill. There's something terrible there's no self-reflection. There's no introspection. There's no acknowledgement that maybe they got something wrong over the last 2 years. Maybe they were cheerleaders for the lockdown. Maybe they defamed the truckers. I've never seen a group so oblivious to what they're like. Every other group in society has had a reckoning. I'm even starting to see it in the courts, but not the media class. They're having panel discussions about how hard done by they are. What do you think of all that?
It's really bizarre, Ezra, I just really have no words. The fact of the matter is that journalists are not supposed to be there to be liked, right? They're supposed to be there to report on the story as objectively and as fairly as they possibly can. There's no question that there was a real disdain for the mainstream media among the protesters. I did see a few mainstream media journalists trying to engage with the protesters, maybe try to speak to the truckers and to some of the protesters, and they were met with a lot of hostility. I didn't see any violent behavior, but I did see a lot of we don't trust the mainstream media, or if you want to talk to us, we're going to record it so that you don't go and try to defame us or anything like that on the narrative media, for sure. But the media still has to work hard to gain people's trust. I think it cannot just be handed to you on a silver platter, and you have to earn their trust. I, as an independent person, was also met with a lot of people didn't really want to speak to me, but I had to really work hard at gaining people's trust, and that was not easy. So it's never good when the media becomes the story, right? Mm-hmm. Journalists should never be the story. And that's unfortunately what ended up happening here. I'm just not sure, and they're never held accountable for anything really, at least for the 3 weeks that the protests happened. In fact, I was held more to account than anybody else. Mm-hmm. My tweets were fisked. My pieces were fact-checked. Everything, you name it, I was held more to account than Justin Trudeau or any of the talking heads on TV. And I, as a freelancer, an outsider in journalism, so that was quite ironic. I just hope, because see, I've seen this movie play out before, where a deep distrust of the media then descends into things that are not good. Your journalists play a vital role, and I think, and that's very important. And there needs to be a real introspection here of what they did wrong, what needs to be done to improve reporting. I feel like many of them have just moved on. The people who had this singular narrative of the protesters have now moved on to reporting on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And, there's just no accountability anywhere.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I actually, the distrust that I myself have learned in the last 2 years from watching the media cover COVID has stayed with me, and I'm extra skeptical of their coverage of Ukraine, and I'm sort of sad about that I've been turned so skeptical, and that what little trust I had has been steamed off by what we've seen over the last little while. Well, I got to tell you, Rupa, it's a pleasure to finally meet you and to talk with you at length. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. And thank you for the journalism you did. And I'm very critical of most journalists, but I have to say, every day I look forward to seeing your side of the story, because you told it like you saw it. You challenged the myths on the other side, and you proved it with photos and video clips and stories. I really benefited a lot from you, and I recommend everyone follow you on Twitter, as I do, and we'll have your Twitter handle underneath. Great to meet you. I hope to talk to you again. And you, along with Rex Murphy and Conrad Black, are my reason for reading the National Post. So keep it up. I think you're doing great.
Thanks, Ezra. It was a real pleasure to be here and to finally meet you.
Well, you're very nice to say that. There you have it. Rupa Subramanya, a freelance columnist at the National Post, in today's Wall Street Journal and other places. Stay with us. More ahead. That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.